Hi there, my name is Francesca Leonardi, and I'm a freshman here at San Diego State in American Indian Studies 225. Decided to focus on the occupations of Mount Rushmore for my essay and my little video lecture because after researching everything that I did, I realized that this is a really important topic to talk about that is still an issue today, and I just felt like I couldn't ignore the subject. So let's get started. All right, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of quiz. First question's easy. Second question, a little bit harder. Third question, I don't know if you'll get it, but we'll see. So, first question. Have you ever heard of the national monument, Mount Rushmore? Yes, no? All right. A little harder now. Second question. Do you know why Mount Rushmore is a national monument in South Dakota? If you answered with anything referring to the commemoration of the United States being a free country for 150 years, I'll give you the point, but prepare for the next question. Finally, do you know whose land was intruded on in order to sculpt the masterpiece of Mount Rushmore into the side of that specific mountain? If you didn't know the answer to this final question, you're not alone, but I urge you to follow along. We have a lot of learning to do. All right, so a little background on Mount Rushmore. This beautiful monument was hand sculpted into the side of the mountain in the Black Hills mountain range of Keystone, South Dakota in 1870. What many Americans don't know is that the land that Mount Rushmore resides on actually belongs to generations of Sioux tribal members. In the mid to late 1800s, unreliable treaties were formed to continuously relocate Native American tribes off of their lands and onto new ones. The Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, involving the Black Hills of South Dakota, is one of them, granting the Sioux tribal members sovereignty over the Black Hills Reservation, west of the Mississippi River. Unsurprisingly, the U.S. government's respect and loyalty to honoring this treaty was pathetic, and the land granted to the Sioux tribe has been violated numerous times, and our national sculpture is no exception. The very monument that we, as Americans, may perceive as patriotic is the very same monument that natives find destructive and disrespectful. All right, so the occupations of Mount Rushmore in the 1970s. There are two very notable protests and occupations of the national monument. One in August of 1970, specifically August 29th, 1970, Native Americans led by the San Francisco-based United Native Americans climbed Mount Rushmore and set up camp to protest the broken Treaty of Fort Laramie. Later on, in 1971, Native Americans led by the American Indian movement ascended and occupied the monument, but were arrested on their return and charged with climbing the monument. Both of these protests in the 1970s were pursued in a peaceful manner to bring light to the Treaty of Fort Laramie that was dishonored by the U.S. government when the land was infringed upon to build the national monument. Native Americans have rejected all monetary offerings by the U.S. government, continuously advocating for the return of land that was so wrongfully taken from them. Their motivation for these protests is driven by their discontent for the theft and desecration of a spiritual site. So my take on Mount Rushmore, after all of the research that I've done, is that the creation of this monument on native land is unjust, not only because the land used for this project was taken without tribal consent, but because the presidents that are honored on this monument were responsible for burdening the Native communities throughout history. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into that. So we're going to start with George Washington. George Washington, the first Mount Rushmore president that I'm discussing, is remembered today as a brave general who fought for our independence and carried the weight of our nation on his shoulders, although his interactions with Native people are anything but praiseworthy. As I've mentioned before, a major conflict between the indigenous peoples and the developing U.S. government was the creation of shaky treaties that, in the long run, were not honored on the U.S. government's end. These treaties were a major player in Washington's Indian policy as he attempted to take control over indigenous lands through fair monetary payments. All right, so now I'm going to discuss Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States and another powerful leader that we honor on the Mount Rushmore National Monument. And he is a man with very similar drive and Indian policy as George Washington. During his time in office, Thomas Jefferson orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase, expanding the U.S. by 827,000 square miles west of the Mississippi River, allowing him to interrupt indigenous communities and attempt to trade land for money. Additionally, in a letter written to William Henry Harrison, Jefferson detailed his intention to drive Native Americans off of their land by setting up trading posts on their lands and forcing them out because they were now in debt and they could not pay it off. As if these deceitful tactics were not enough, Jefferson gave natives the ultimatum to either be absorbed into the United States or face military obliteration. All right, so now I'm going to speak on Abraham Lincoln, the third face of Mount Rushmore, a man who continued to force natives onto reservations away from their sacred land and allowed policies to pass that were detrimental to Native culture. Two of these policies include the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, which actually both allowed for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, also leading to significant loss of land and natural resources, as well as the loss of lifestyle and culture for the natives who inhabited that land. All right, and the final president that I'm speaking on is Theodore Roosevelt. And to start my discussion on Theodore Roosevelt, I would just like you to hear something that he said in a speech in New York in 1886, about 10, 14 years prior to when he was actually president of the United States. So he says, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are." Then he proceeds to say that that 10th is questionable. This is ridiculous, implying that indigenous peoples are literally better off dead. As you can see, he had a little bit of bias. So when he did become president, what he wanted to do was assimilate the natives and turn them into white men. He is notorious for the haircut order that he forced upon Indians in order to hasten their progress towards civilization, despite the cultural and spiritual significance that long hair in Native culture represents. He also allowed them to be educated in industrial education so they could work, but stripping them of their cultural significance in any way. So, as this discussion of the 4 faces of Mount Rushmore exposes some of the significant acts against Native American culture, it's important to note that I have barely scratched the surface on the injustices faced by our tribal communities. From forced assimilation to conquering spiritual land of Native significance, the faces of Mount Rushmore remain on sovereign Native territory as a reminder of the disrespect that they have faced throughout history. With new knowledge of the historic significance of the presidents of Mount Rushmore, it's clear to see why Native Americans continue to protest the monument and will not rest when it comes to fighting for their voices to be heard and their treaties to be honored. And to develop an even deeper understanding of why the Indigenous felt a passion for protest at the site of Mount Rushmore National Monument, there is one more aspect of this topic that I do want to disclose, and that is how Indigenous peoples are still, to this day, disrespected by the US government at the site of Mount Rushmore. So on July 3rd, 2020, our former president, Donald Trump, enjoyed an extravagant fireworks show at the site of Mount Rushmore, despite the banning of fireworks from this location in 2009 due to the hazardous environmental risk that these annual fireworks shows cause. Despite the minimum of 27 fires that were started because of the annual fireworks shows at Mount Rushmore and the groundwater pollution that has been documented, Donald Trump was enthused that his efforts to bring back the show were successful nonetheless. Without surprise, his unthoughtful event fueled a fire of anger and disgust in disgust within Native Americans and reaffirmed the lack of respect and loyalty, native land, and upholding the broken treaties of the complicated past. In the back of this slide here, there's a picture of Native Americans protesting these fireworks. Some of the signs saying "Respect Mother Earth" and "Honor our broken treaties." Alrighty, so today, many citizens of the United States still do not understand the true meaning behind Mount Rushmore from the indigenous perspective and only recognize the monument as a symbol for American freedom. It's important to bring attention to all perspectives and historical context to fully understand any and all distraught brought amongst minority groups, because their interpretation of Mount Rushmore is far different than the average white American. We, as educated and privileged individuals of this country, must fight for minority justice and freedoms, because we don't need to fight for our own the way that they need to fight for their own. We can be allies that stand in defiance of an aesthetically pleasing monument that is meaningless, symbolizing empty promises that do not represent the nation as a whole. So that's all for me today. Thank you for listening to my speech on Mount Rushmore and the occupations and why I think it's inappropriate and why I need to bring my voice to it. And I hope you have a great summer and remainder of your semester.